For centuries, humans have explored and conquered new frontiers. From early explorers charting the seas to the expansion of the United States with Louisiana Purchase, man has always been hungry to conquer the unknown. However, with no more room for expansion on Earth, space is the new frontier. The next step for humanity is to settle on other planets and become an interplanetary species. On July 20th, 1969, we took our first steps towards that goal.
In just 50 minutes from now, well within the hour, the moon is due to have visitors from another planet.
The crew of Apollo 11 made history that day, taking the first steps on the moon, thus bringing an end to the space race. 5 successful manned lunar missions followed, with the last in 1972 with Apollo 17. However, after the Apollo missions, we've stopped bringing people to the moon.
In this proposal sent to the Nixon White House, NASA's Space Task Group planned to send astronauts to Mars by 1986. Obviously, that hasn't happened. With NASA's current budget of $22.6 billion, just 0.5% of the national budget, there won't be any Apollos happening anytime soon. Also, public interest in space just isn't there. In a poll done by Pew Research, less than 1 out of 5 Americans believe that a manned expedition to Mars should be one of NASA's top priorities. However, with the rise of private space companies such as SpaceX starting to spark public interest in space once again, Mars is looking to be a reachable conquest for settlement. What will this future on Mars look like? What can we learn from history? Will countries cooperate to achieve this extraordinary goal?
Man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred.
We can follow our dreams to distant stars, living and working in space for peaceful economic and scientific gain.
What distinguishes Mars One is that when you go, there are no plans to bring you back.
The good news is that if we move out into the solar system, for all practical purposes, we have unlimited resources.
Make Mars seem possible. Make it seem as though it's something that we can do in our lifetimes.
Here, America's newest weapons have been tested. This is the Army's Corporal, the nation's first operational surface-to-surface guided missile.
The rush to space all started back in the 1940s after World War II. The United States and the Soviet Union fought as allies against Nazi Germany, but soon after the war ended in 1945, the alliance shattered.
That assistance is imperative if Greece is to survive as a free nation.
With the implementation of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan in 1947, the U.S. pledged billions of dollars to foreign governments threatened by communist rule. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union created an alliance of communist governments in Eastern Europe through the 1955 Warsaw Pact. This conflict only grew bigger through proxy wars in Vietnam, Korea, and Cuba, eventually turning into the historical event we know today as the Cold War.
President Eisenhower reassures the nation that Russia's success with the first satellite does not indicate a serious lag in American rocket research.
Spaceflight was seen as necessary for national security, and space started to be used as yet another arena for the US and the Soviet Union to project power during the Cold War. The Soviet Union became the first to successfully launch a satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957. They were also the first to put man in orbit with Yuri Gagarin. A series of tit-for-tat competitions followed as each country raced with each other for higher and higher achievements, eventually peaking when the US landed the first man on the moon in 1969 with Apollo 11.
To start at the back end, the Apollo model took us to the moon, and then we quit. Just on that ground, it's not a good model for ultimate settlement on another celestial body. That's because it had a specific purpose, and the purpose was to demonstrate national power by being first to the moon. It was a race, and once you won the race, there was no need to keep racing.
So there definitely won't be another Cold War-esque space race to Mars. Instead, international cooperation is likely to lead the cause.
Space is a relatively new field in international law. The basis for space law was only set forth in 1967 through the first Outer Space Treaty. As of today, 109 countries are parties to the treaty. Back then, it was a remarkable feat of international cooperation In the midst of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States both agreed to preserve space as a peaceful domain for research and exploration. Here are just a few rules it established. Access to space should be equitable for everyone. No country can claim sovereignty to space or any celestial body. No nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction are allowed in space. Each nation is liable for their own actions in outer space, including damage to other nations' objects. Any objects that are launched into space remain in full sovereignty of the launching nation.
This is the most important part. Space is the common province of mankind. It emphasizes the status of peace and cooperation in space. Subsequent outer space treaties such as the Moon Treaty were written, but they didn't achieve the same level of ratification as the first Outer Space Treaty. The Moon Treaty proposed a set of laws specifically for celestial bodies. It proclaimed that lunar resources should not be appropriated by any entity, and that any benefits gained from extraterrestrial resources should be shared by all nations, irrespective of their degree of involvement. That's probably why none of the countries capable of spaceflight signed the treaty. Many state-owned or private companies are planning to mine resources on the moon, and these rules would undermine the purposes of commercial activity.
Who's going to invest in that if they have to share the fruits of their investment equally with everybody? That's not a real viable economic model for doing that. The Moon Treaty has hardly any adherence to it. It's not nearly the same level of acceptance in international law, and I don't think that's really setting the precedents that we're talking about for these kind of governance regimes. So to me, that's going to be the next big point of contention.
Currently, the only operational crewed space station is the ISS, which is governed by the International Space Station Intergovernmental Agreement, a legal framework of 15 nations that operate on the ISS. This agreement sets the rules for intellectual property created in space, as well as criminal jurisdiction. As first laid out by the Outer Space Treaty, the IGA, as it is called, states that each module is owned and operated by its nation of registry, and respective nations can apply national laws to the boundaries of their own modules. For instance, if an astronaut produces new intellectual property, it is subject to the national laws of the module it was conceived in. Each module is essentially an extension of national territory. Since there aren't any well-established legal precedents in space, are there any earthly frameworks we can build off of?
In Antarctica, there is a treaty, 1959 Antarctic Treaty, which says that there's no sovereignty in Antarctica. Nobody claims the territory, which is also the condition in the Outer Space Treaty. Even if China or the United States or some other country goes to Mars with people and plants the flag, that does not mean they're claiming the territory. Under international law, they cannot do that. In the summer in Antarctica, there are 4,000 people. So there's a pretty significant human outposts in Antarctica, and there are something like 60 different research stations run by different countries, and they all cooperate. So take a look at the Antarctic model for the likely evolution of what's going to happen on Mars.
Part of the reason the treaties haven't been updated since 1998 plays on how much power the US received with them.
The United States is concerned about is we feel that the Outer Space Treaty is probably the best deal we're going to get, and we're reluctant to reopen that because it's possible that some kind of overarching space legal regime would be less favorable to our interests than what we have in the Outer Space Treaty regime.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff of the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon. Go NASA, go SpaceX, Godspeed, Spot and Dog.
The last major event of colonization took place in the last 500 years. This time around, the rush to space won't be as Eurocentric. More private companies will play a role too.
During the 1950s and 60s, that was the era of great decolonization on Earth. So you went from 50, 60 countries up to however many we have today, nearing 200 countries. And really, I think the number one objective of the Outer Space Treaty was to preclude colonization in space in the same way that it happened on Earth, because obviously lots of problems with that. If the current trends hold, it'll be the United States and China that will be the key drivers on this. Space is very expensive still. We have all kinds of hope that Elon Musk and others are going to really bring down the cost, but as of right now, it's still one of the most expensive and long-term investments that anyone is making.
Countries seem to be going for a collaborative approach this time around as well, more ISS, less Cold War style.
I think that the model for the exploration of Mars is going to be international cooperation of some form. And I think the major precedent for that will be what we do on the moon in the next 20 years or 30 years.
However, just because we've already completed the ISS doesn't mean that we can just place another ISS on Mars. Settlements on celestial bodies are inherently more complicated. There are a lot more factors to take into account. Just the abundance of valuable resources such as metals on the moon and Mars means that a more general, overarching treaty garnering more international recognition will have to be created. In the 21st century, it's not just government agencies dominating space. Private companies have joined the game. New laws will have to control the scope of commercial activities in space.
They were written in the 60s when it was purely a government area of activity. They did not anticipate a significant private sector role. And so there's an ongoing debate of whether the Outer Space Treaty and the other related treaties need updating or replacing to reflect 21st century realities.
Conflicts may still arise, however. In 2013, the US attempted to establish sovereignty on the moon by claiming the Apollo 11 landing site as a national park. It turned heads in the international community as in violation of the Outer Space Treaties, it effectively turned a part of the moon into American territory. There's even a significant amount of competition in low Earth orbit. There's a finite number of orbital spots for satellites due to the risk of collisions and radio interference between them. Companies and countries often bid for the best orbits covering areas of geopolitical significance. The International Telecommunications Union has organized the equitable access of different countries and companies to low Earth orbit since 1963.
There's a lot of competition for geostationary orbital slots, and there has been for decades. The International Telecommunications Union has done a pretty good job of adjudicating that, but it's also a reflection of the fact that the technology for those satellites has improved and allowed them to be a lot more closely spaced. If we were still using the same kind of technology we used back in the 60s, our current governance regime for that orbit spectrum resource that the ITU governs would be inadequate. So, I mean, to me, that's kind of an example of how these things evolve.
In the distant future, when more countries have space capabilities, space may end up being crowded. There may be competition for areas on celestial bodies with geopolitical or material significance.
I think another major point of contention is going to be on the moon, particularly the polar regions of the moon. Is the moon big enough for everybody? I mean, let's just say the Chinese have the North Pole and we have the South Pole. Maybe we can all get along well. But to me, that's going to be the next kind of major point of contention.
Another important area to consider is space power and the militarization of space. As more countries become space capable, space will start to be considered as another arena for power projection. The US has already founded the Space Force, which was a controversial decision. How power dynamics will work in space is the ultimate question. International relations theories pertaining to space just haven't been considered thoroughly yet. Sea power theories, such as those laid out by Alfred Thayer Mahan, explain naval power dynamics and how different countries rely on the sea for national power. Land power theories explore land-based powers, but space might be completely different.
Is it different or is it the same? And if it's the same, what are the best analogs and analogies between how power is used on Earth and how do they apply in space? In my opinion, those questions are not resolved yet, and we don't have the equivalent of a Sun Tzu or Clausewitz or Mahan or Mitchell or Duhay. I mean, we don't have that level of thinking about space power yet. So I'll just mention a book I just got to by a guy named Bledin Bowen. He's a Welshman. So his idea is that instead of going to people like Alfred Thayer Mahan, who think mostly about how to use sea power on the open ocean, we should be thinking about continental sea powers. People that didn't really have a lot of reliance on the sea for their national power. So states like France, Russia. So he's saying those theorists more closely align than the people that Brits and Americans naturally go to, because we have been very reliant on the sea.
While the diplomatic future of Martian settlements remains to be seen, we are a lot closer today to settling on Mars than we were just a decade ago.
The problem is that if you depend on public opinion to stimulate exploration, it's not going to happen. It is really, in my mind, a leadership issue. So what it's going to take is leadership that believes that a sustained space exploration program is important for the country, important for the world, and is willing to commit some level of resources, not on a crash basis and not at the Apollo level, to making it happen. That has not happened in the United States since 1972.
New developments constantly bring us closer, day by day.
I think it's going to be your grandchildren's lifetime before there are lots of people on Mars.
As we see these advances in technology, much needed updates to international space treaties will begin shortly after.
What will be the governance structures? How will conflict be resolved? That's really the key dynamics that we're trying to get after. We want a more peaceful and cooperative future.
While we can never truly determine what international relations in space will look like until a later date, we trend toward cooperation between the private and public sectors.
I don't think any one individual or any one private company is going to be able to do this on its own. They will play a role. I think it will be government-industry partnership that will enable the travel to Mars, opening up to Mars.
These connections will cause significantly less conflicts in the coming years so that we may reach a greater future for all.